Hello, good evening. So I'm back with a small module, around half an hour. So in the last class we were making general statements about teaching learning, especially teaching learning of languages. Some of the issues involved in teaching learning, especially teaching learning of languages. Now, I hope you had a look at the book I sent you, Jack Richards and Theodore Rogers' book on various methods of teaching language, teaching English in particular. So you must have noticed that if you read through the description of the methods, you find that there are certain basic issues on which the methods differ from one another. So let us briefly see what they are. One, of course, is the approach to teaching learning, of which I talked to you about in several classes earlier. A few on teaching of English, and earlier when I was discussing other things with you. So, I think I briefly mentioned the major approaches to teaching learning. The behaviorist approach, for example, which takes language performance as a kind of behavior, verbal behavior. So all you do is to learn things like you learn gestures, like animals learn tricks in the circus. Okay, so your learning is reinforced by continuous practice, which is called drilling. Okay, and if you like animals in the circus, you are offered rewards. In other words, what you're doing is simply to imitate what is shown to you, or to obey orders. Okay, something in which the learner has very, if any, role. Yeah, this we know. Where it's not your power of reasoning, it's not the active use of intelligence, but the way you imitate others, the way you pick up things through continuous practice. Right. Item number 2, or approach number 2, is what is called the cognitive approach, which looks at learning as a rational process. Okay, you try to make sense of language. You try to make sense of language. You try to understand how it works. Okay, you learn the rules not deductively but inductively. You know, when you look at like what Newton did. Okay, when you saw an apple fall, he decided that something was happening. What was that? Gravity. The apple fell to the ground because it was propelled by gravity. As soon as it broke free from the branch, it fell to the ground. This is called inductive reasoning. So when you hear a sentence like, would you like a cup of ice cream? Okay, you decide that a question is asked by, a yes or no question is asked by a sentence with in which the word, an auxiliary, begins the enunciation. Would, could, may, might, whatever. Okay, and you learn that there is an inversion. Okay, would you like a cup of ice cream? Okay, you like a cup of ice cream, then you put would before, and you raise the tone of your voice. This is simply the spoken part of it, but at least you learn that you can ask yes or no questions this way. This is called inductive reasoning. So, and Chomsky said that this is how you actually learn languages, by a cognitive process, by using your intelligence, right? So a lot more can be said about this, but this is just in brief. I have sent you some material which will make it very clear why this second approach or the second method, second way in which you learn language is generally understood as the as something that really happens. Right. So again, within the cognitive approach, you have other approaches like constructivist approach, where there is a lot of learner autonomy, where the learner is said to construct the language by using their reason, power of reasoning. Okay, and something which goes still further, called social constructivism, where yes, of course, you create knowledge. You create knowledge on your own. Okay, by using already existing knowledge, by making use of your surroundings, by taking help from peers, everything fine. But social constructivism also says that you learn things while you are doing things. Okay, which means mixing with very liberally with people. Okay, engaging in conversation, doing something during which you use language. In fact, social interaction. Okay. Then, of course, there are a number of other things like, this social constructivism is sometimes called activity theory. So forget about the jargon which people use. They use so many things. Just look at these things in a broad way. Right. So we started with behaviorism, went on to cognitivism, something which Noam Chomsky endorsed by saying that language is built into your brain. All you have to do is to activate it. Okay. So language is said. The problem is which language. If you are exposed to Malayalam, you will make sense of Malayalam. If you are exposed to English, you will make sense of English, and so on. So this happens because you carefully observe the way in which language works, and you decide how language can be, how language works, how it is structured, right? So this is social constructivism, and the number of other words that you hear. Okay, activity theory on learning is nothing but social constructivism. You hear it often. Okay, now the most important thing is, this book I sent you is a little conservative. It does not discuss in any detail what we call constructivism or social constructivism, right? Although when you come to a method like communicative method, you are offered live situations, okay, in which you practice language. Okay, you engage in conversation, right? Okay, so this approach is one thing. Two, the involvement of the learner. Question is it a learner-centered theory, or is it a teacher-centered theory, or is a teacher always necessary in the classroom? Can you dispense with the teacher? Okay, teacher in that famous song, leave our kids alone, the 1980s song. Okay, hey teacher, leave our kids alone. Teaching is considered to be a toxic activity. Okay, it teaches you all the wrong things. Okay, or in other words, a teacher is a hindrance to learning. Okay, between the learner and the learning material, an unnecessary intrusion. So forget the teacher or kick the teacher out. Okay, although generally classrooms do not do that normally, schools do not do that, but there is a limit to which the teacher can um, impose her will in the classroom. There is a limit to which the teacher can go in controlling the classroom. Right. So that is what we are looking at. How much of teacher control is there? How much of learner involvement is there? Right. 3. Whether we are talking about learning a second language. Okay. So when you do this, whether you can use your mother tongue in the classroom. So there are several methods which prohibit this completely. Direct method, for example, which came into vogue in the early 20th century. You'll read all these. The direct method actually prohibits the use of the mother tongue, first language. You're not allowed to use the mother tongue in the classroom. But the mother tongue is simply kicked out. You learn English, French, German, Hindi, whatever language you are learning, you learn directly in the classroom. Whereas the grammar translation method allowed the use of the mother tongue liberally. You can use it as much as you want. So that is another thing. The use of the mother tongue. How much of it is allowed? Number 4. What do you give preferential treatment for? The spoken language or the written language? Here again, various methods and concepts differ. The grammar translation method, for example, gave more importance to the written language. What you are trying to do is to learn to read and write the language. Okay. Whereas the communicative method of teaching, or the audio-lingual method of teaching, or the direct method of teaching, all these methods you are going to look at, or certain exotic methods like the silent method, where the teacher will not speak a word. He'll simply play music, ask you to listen to conversations, use flashcards, okay, show you videos. All these came later. Okay, you simply got to look at these materials and learn. The teacher won't say a word in the classroom. So all these are different methods, okay, which take this notion of involvement on the one hand, the use of the spoken, the relative importance to the spoken or the written language on the other, and then of course the involvement of the teacher in the classroom. Okay, so this is what's happening. So again, then there are other criteria with which to measure a method, any particular method. Okay, the use of audio-visual media. Okay, and now you can think of the use of ICT in the classroom. What is ICT? ICT is information and communication technology. Okay, simply the use of computers, and of course your recourse to online resources, asking you to go online, pick up things from the net. Right. Now, if you look at the grammar translation method, the oldest method of language teaching in Europe. So how did you learn a new language? You learned a new language by one, learning the grammatical rules and applying it to the second language that you are learning. This is called the deductive method, D-E-D-U-C-T-I-V, deductive methods. You learn a particular rule. You learn a particular grammatical rule. For instance, the standard word order in English is SVO, subject, verb, object. Okay, and then you learn this. You learn there are 8 parts of speech. You learn that you can turn an active voice into sentence into a passive voice sentence in a certain manner. Right. So the deductive learning of grammar. Whereas in the direct method or the audio-lingual method, communicative method, which we use today, we are still to actually fashion a constructivist method of learning language. It was tried in 1995. We don't have any theoretical description of this method. Okay, like for example, students were asked to visit places. Okay, hospital for example, and then write about the hospital. The students were asked to listen to the teacher talking in the classroom, and they were asked to comment on it. Okay, by involvement, by production of language. Whereas in this earliest method, which we call the grammar translation method, all you do was to learn through reading. Spoken language was given a go by. You don't care about spoken language. Reading is your ultimate aim. The second language you are learning will become your library language. You learn it and you start reading from it. Okay, and the teaching demanded absolute correctness. Another feature of traditional methods of learning. Okay, precision. Okay, it did not give any leeway for variables. There are variables available. There are dialects available. Within the same community, people speak differently. There are fuzzy grammatical properties. Okay, you can say it ain't me instead of saying it isn't me. Or I am not, I ain't instead of I am not, etc. So the grammar translation method classroom, the teacher in the grammar translation method classroom will tell you that you shouldn't say I ain't. You should say I am not. Or I aren't. That's allowed. You can say I aren't. Okay. So the insistence on what? Precision. It did not take into consideration what we now commonly recognize, language change. So language doesn't change. It remains immutable, unchanging over a long period of time, forever. And you are given dictation, your composition is corrected. Every way in which your written language is cultivated. Right. And there was also something called translation. Okay. You are given a passage to translate. Okay. Mostly from Latin. Latin was the commonly taught classical language. So you have to translate from Latin. You can do that here in Malayalam, for example. You are given an English sentence, you translate it into Malayalam. And if your translation is accurate, it means that you have understood the English sentence. So this is not bad. In fact, Stephen Krashen, who is by no means an advocate of the grammar translation method, says that the proof of your learning is your understanding of a sentence. If you have understood a sentence, if you have understood a conversation, if you have understood a command, a direction given by somebody, it means that you have learned the language. So that way it's okay. you've understood the language. The common method of translation. This was employed very early in ancient Rome, when the Romans who were learning Greek were asked to translate into Latin, which was the then spoken language in Rome, in the Roman Empire. So, of the official language of the Roman Empire. So, what you do is to write correctly, to translate correctly, okay, to learn the rules of composition, okay, and it didn't matter if you speak badly. So, the emphasis on written language also means that you will only be taught what is called standard vocabulary, standard expressions. In fact, the language that you need for writing, spoken language will not come in. Conversation does not come in. If you learn a language, it doesn't enable you to buy something from a shop, go to a bank, take a ticket from the railway station, nothing. Such practical considerations were simply disregarded, neglected. The language was intended to be your library language, and occasionally for you to write something, a letter, an official letter, a composition. So this was, but remember that this was the method which was employed for centuries. Okay. Right up to the end of the 19th century. I'm not saying that it is not effective. As I told you in the last class, any method has some value. Okay, you can't throw it into the dustbin. Right. So the grammar translation method is all right in its time. Okay. When people did not need conversational language to be taught in the classroom. So if they are going abroad, let us say, of course, they learn the language through practice. And Chaucer was an ambassador in the French court for some time, the English king's ambassador. So he could speak French, he could speak Italian. That he learned not from the classroom but from practice, interacting with people who spoke French or Italian. So that is something you recognize as outside the academia, right? So grammar translation method catered to scholars, basically. If you want to become a scholar, if you want to become a learned pundit in a language, you can very well become a pundit. And as you know, the grammar translation method allowed the use of the mother tongue. As you know, translation was allowed. And you could compare the grammatical rules of your first language with the second language, those of the second language that you were learning. Today we don't allow that much. Okay. So we don't compare the word order in English with the word order in Malayalam. We don't say that SVO is the word order in English, but SOV is only in linguistics you do that. Okay. Not when you are learning a language. In linguistics, of course, as you know, in the last sem, I told you about different word orders, different structural properties across languages. Fine. But not, I never compare this when I am teaching students English in the school, in a school classroom, for example. So, I simply compare, if I were a teacher in the early 19th century, I would compare structural properties. Okay. Not entirely useless. You don't throw it into the dustbin. It comes useful sometimes. Okay, right. That you can compare, that you get an idea about the two languages, so that you don't mix them up. Okay. Whereas today what we do is we learn it intuitively, inductively, without being told. So we know that, for instance, we say Dr. Richards in English. And in Malayalam, quite often you put the name first. You say Prabhakaran Doctor. This is a different way of writing or using a title. Okay. Radhakrishna Marsh. Right. The Marsh comes after the name. So this you know through the use of both languages. Okay. If you know the use of both languages, you know that when something is named after a person, in English you write an apostrophe S. For example, Adam's Bridge in Rameshwaram. Whereas in Malayalam you don't use that apostrophe, genitive suffix. You simply say Moidu Palam, the bridge near Talacheri, named after somebody called Moidu. You don't say Moidu in Palam. So how do you know? How do you know that? If you know the difference through practice. You are not taught this in the classroom today. Okay. But in the grammar translation method, these are some of the things that you will be taught. You will be taught that there are 8 parts of speech in English. In Malayalam, we don't divide sentences into 8 parts. In classical grammar, even in Malayalam grammar, we have only 3 types of words. Okay. They are nouns, verbs and adjectives. Okay. Perecham, Vinecham, and the other one, Visheshanam. 3 types of words. So this doesn't mean that Malayalam is a less efficient language than English. It only means that in Malayalam this is how we learn grammar. Right? So this was the way in which language was taught. I'm not saying it's completely useless. Okay, it worked in its time, and the insistence on precision. You have to use the language very precisely. Okay, you don't make mistakes. You have to write your sentences according to the prevailing grammatical structure, and your insistence on only one correct answer. Right? You don't have alternatives. You don't say, today we realize this, that there are different ways in which different structures which are allowed for us to use. Okay. For example, certain disputed case, for example, that and which. Okay. In American English, many people insist that when you are talking about something in the plural, you should say which. The ideas which I try to communicate. But if it's a singular, you say the idea that I tried to communicate. But other people dispute this. Okay, this division is arbitrary. They say that, but people use both. Many people use both, that and which, indiscriminately. Right. But grammar translation method did not allow this. Okay. It insisted on an immutable precision. Right. And while people were learning languages, they realized that they should aim for precision. Okay. So here you realize the danger, getting certain habits fixed. You can't change them. You quarrel with people, and somebody tells you, no, you can also say the same thing like this. Grammar translation method did not allow that. And it worked for a long time. It was probably ideal in its own time. The language teaching did not aim at people who went abroad to work. If you learn Arabic, for example, for getting a good job in UAE or Saudi Arabia, you are talking about spoken Arabic mainly. Grammar translation method will not work. If you are a khatib, a learned scholar who can read the Quran or the Hadith, it doesn't mean that you will succeed as a good employee or a manager in the UAE, right? So this is how grammar translation method worked and how grammar translation method legitimized itself, right? So I think a half an hour module is enough for you. If I go on speaking, you will get bored. But I'll be back, right? Good evening.